On the frontier, they told stories of an Apache woman the size of a grizzly, a warrior carved from the living stone of the prairie. Sheriff Grimes of Dusty Gulch had always considered them drunken fantasies until he saw her in chains, put up for sale like a curiosity. The laugh died in his throat. The legend was real. But even more real was the Colt peacemaker pressed to his skull by a short, wiry man whose eyes were harder than steel. "I'm choosing a wife," the dwarf cowboy hissed, and his voice was as quiet as the rustle of a rattlesnake. The sheriff and his men could have killed him in a second, but not before he sent their boss to hell. And in that moment, Grimes understood the terrible truth. This wasn't a sale. It was a claiming. The dwarf wasn't buying the giantess. He was taking her. The man who held the gun was Silas Kane, and he had been a ghost for a month. He moved through the world as a phantom of dust and leather, his presence felt only when he collected the bounty. He'd spent 37 days tracking the Miller brothers through the Alkali Flats, a job no one else wanted. The sun had baked the flats into a cracked white hell, but Silas read the land in a way other men read books. He saw a turned stone, a bent blade of grass, a faint scuff mark in the dust, and from them he constructed a story. The story ended, as it always did, with the quiet click of his Winchester and a silent ride back to civilization. He slid the sack of coins across the U.S. Marshal's desk. The money felt weightless, unreal. He didn't count it. His payment wasn't in the coins, but in the finality of the act itself. A job begun, a job finished, an equation balanced. He tucked the money into his saddlebag and allowed himself a single luxury, a half-filled canteen of water to wash the grime from his face. As the cool water touched his skin, the world of dust and sun fell away, and for a half-second he was somewhere else entirely. A different fire. The scent of pine and blood. A great man, an Apache chief named Taki, lay dying, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Taki, who had once saved a much younger Silas from a winter grave, his body broken and near frozen. The debt was absolute. Taki pressed a small, intricately carved wooden bird into Silas's hand, its wings outstretched. The wood was warm, almost alive. "A life for a life," the old chief had rasped. "Swear it. Protect her. When the time comes, swear it." Silas had sworn. The oath had settled into him deeper than bone. The memory vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving only the ghost of the bird's shape in his palm. He mounted his horse, the sacred token safely tucked in a leather pouch against his chest. He was a professional. He was a man of contracts and of oaths. There was a difference. One was business. The other was the architecture of a man's soul. He rode east toward the squalid, fly-blown town of Dusty Gulch, drawn by a whisper on the wind, a rumor of a railroad baron's cruelty and a prize of war put on public display. Drawn by the weight of the bird and the gravity of his vow, Dusty Gulch was a fresh wound carved into the prairie, a monument to greed built of raw timber and desperation. The railroad was coming, and with it, men like Marcus Thorne, who bought land with contracts and cleared it with hired guns. Silas's presence went unnoticed, a small man on a tired horse, just another shadow in a town full of them. He dismounted, his movements economical and quiet, his eyes scanning, reading the story of the town in the faces of its people. He saw the hard-faced men with rifles, Thorne's men, their authority lazy and brutal. He saw the townsfolk, their fear a sour scent in the air. And he heard the laughter, coarse and ugly, coming from the crude auction block in the center of town. There he saw her, Anaya, the chief's daughter. She was not in chains. Chains would have been an insult to the steel in her spine. She stood on the block, a prisoner, yes, but unbowed. The stories hadn't lied. She was a giantess, a being of impossible scale and power. Even standing still, there was a kinetic energy to her, the sense of a storm held in check. She wore a simple deerskin dress, but on her it looked like the armor of a goddess. The townsfolk gawked and jeered. They saw a monster, a freak, a curiosity. Silas saw the daughter of the man who had saved his life. He saw the living embodiment of his sacred, unbreakable oath. Sheriff Grimes, a corpulent man sweating in the afternoon sun, was the auctioneer. He was a creature of Marcus Thorne, a man whose soul had been bought and paid for. "What am I bid for this Apache savage?" Grimes bellowed, his voice slick with contempt. "A prize from the recent unpleasantness. Strong as an ox she is, good for labor if you can break her." Silas felt the world go quiet. The jeering crowd, the buzzing flies, the groaning timber of the new saloon, it all faded into a dull hum. There was only the woman on the block and the crushing weight of the bird against his chest. His oath wasn't to buy her freedom. His oath was to protect her. A sale was a transaction. This required an act of fundamental correction. He began to move, not toward the auctioneer, but in a slow, deliberate arc around the edge of the crowd. He was a predator circling the herd, unseen, unimportant, until the moment of the strike. "She's a big one, ain't she?" Grimes roared with laughter, feeding the crowd's cruel amusement. "Might take 2 men just to handle her. Who'll start the bidding? Any wife you want is up here, boys." That was when the cold steel of Silas's Colt pressed into the soft flesh behind Grimes's ear. The sheriff froze, his laughter catching in his throat like a chicken bone. The crowd went silent. All they saw was a small, dusty man who had appeared from nowhere, his face devoid of all emotion save a terrifying, absolute focus. "I'm choosing a wife," Silas Kane hissed, and his voice was the sound of gravel on a tombstone, quiet and final. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence filled with the dawning comprehension of the crowd, the silent cocking of a dozen rifles by Thorne's men, the widening of Grimes's terrified eyes. They saw the suicidal foolishness of the act, a single small man against a town of killers. They could riddle him with bullets. But Grimes saw the truth in the dead certainty of Silas's eyes. He saw a man who had already balanced the equation, a man who understood the price and was willing to pay it. And in that moment, the sheriff knew that no matter what happened in the next 10 seconds, his own story had already reached its end. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about a purchase. This was something older, something sacred and terrible. This was a claiming, and the price was going to be paid not in gold, but in blood. They rode hard for a day and a night, a frantic, desperate flight into the jagged teeth of the canyons. Silas led them, his small frame a compact engine of efficiency on his horse, his eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines behind them. He did not need to look to know they were being followed. He could feel the pursuit, a cold pressure against the back of his neck. Anaya rode beside him, her presence a silent, towering mountain. She had not spoken a single word since leaving Dusty Gulch, but her eyes were alive, taking in every detail of the land with an intensity that unsettled him. This was her world, he realized. He was a trespasser here. By the second morning, the pursuit was no longer a feeling. It was a cloud of dust on the horizon, a baker's dozen of Thorne's men, led by a vengeful Sheriff Grimes. Silas guided their horses into a narrow box canyon, a dead end with walls of sheer, sun-baked rock. It was a kill box, but it was a defensible one. He dismounted, pulling the Winchester from its scabbard. "This is as far as we go," he said, his voice flat. He didn't look at her. "Find what cover you can. This will be loud." He was a professional preparing for a job. He saw the equation clearly, 13 men against his rifle and 2 pistols. The math was bad. He had made a promise to protect her, and he would fulfill that contract even if it cost him his life. It was a matter of honor. Anaya, however, was not looking for cover. She was looking at the canyon walls, her head tilted, a strange light in her eyes. She dismounted and walked to the base of the cliff, placing a hand flat against the sun-warmed stone. She closed her eyes, and for a long moment she was utterly still, as if listening to the rock itself. "My father called this place the Brittle Bone," she said, her voice a low rumble, startling Silas after a day of silence. "He said that from the outside it looks strong, but its heart is hollow." She turned her gaze not to Silas, but to a massive teetering pillar of rock that loomed over the canyon entrance, a sentinel of stone held in place by a fragile stone key. Silas followed her gaze. He was an expert in demolitions. He understood pressure points and stress fractures. He saw it immediately. It was an act of God waiting for a push. But the pillar was 100 feet high, 10,000 tons of solid rock. A push was impossible. "There's no time," he began, turning back to the approaching posse. He never finished the sentence. Anaya was already moving. She did not run. She moved with the fluid, terrifying grace of a landslide. She braced her powerful legs, her bare feet finding purchase on the scree. She set her shoulders, the muscles in her back and arms coiling into knots of living granite. With a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the canyon, she drove her shoulder into the base of a support rock, a wedge of stone the size of a wagon. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan that echoed through the ages, the keystone shifted. A crack appeared, a dark spider web against the red rock, then another. Dust and pebbles rained down. The posse, now at the canyon mouth, reined in their horses, their faces a mask of confusion and dawning terror. High above, the great stone pillar shuddered. It leaned, slow and majestic, seeming to hang in the air for an eternal second before it surrendered to gravity. It fell with a sound like the world breaking, a cataclysm of shattered rock and choking dust that tore through the canyon. It didn't just block the pass, it erased it. Where there had been an entrance, there was now a new mountain of rubble 100 feet high. The dust settled, revealing a scene of utter silence. The posse was gone, vanished behind the impassable wall of their own making. Silas stood, his rifle hanging limply in his hand, his professional calculations, his honorable last stand, all rendered utterly irrelevant. He looked at Anaya, who stood panting, her body covered in a fine layer of dust, her knuckles bleeding where she had struck the stone. He wasn't looking at a debt to be protected. He was looking at a force of nature, a partner. He saw then with shocking clarity that his plan was to die for her. Her plan was for them to live. The thought was still settling in his mind when she turned to him. "This is not over," she said, her voice low and certain. "Thorn will not stop. The new mountain you see is not a wall. It is just a delay. We have to keep moving." They rode for another 2 days, deeper into the maze of canyons, the silence between them no longer one of strangeness, but of a new, shared reality. Finally, they came to a sheer rock face, hidden by a curtain of ancient gnarled willows. It looked like another dead end. Anaya dismounted and pushed aside the curtain, revealing a dark, narrow slit in the rock, barely wide enough for a horse to pass. "The still place," she said. Inside, the world changed. The oppressive sun and red rock gave way to a hidden valley, a bowl of impossible green cradled in the heart of the stone. A small, clear spring fed a meadow thick with flowers and plants Silas had never seen before. It was a sanctuary, a secret garden hidden from the world. For the first time, he saw the tension leave Anaya's shoulders. Here, she was not a legend or a prisoner. She was home. They made a small camp. As the sun set, painting the valley walls in shades of gold and purple, Silas pulled the small leather pouch from his chest. He took out the carved wooden bird and held it out to her. "I swore an oath to your father," he said, his voice quiet, almost raw. "He saved my life. I gave him my word I would protect you. I've brought you home. The debt is paid." He placed the bird in her palm, a weight lifted from his soul. He was free. He could ride out in the morning, back to his world of contracts and ghosts. His honor was satisfied. Anaya looked at the bird, then at Silas. A sad, knowing smile touched her lips. "You think this is about a home?" she asked. She stood and walked him to the center of the meadow, kneeling to touch the leaves of a small, silver-leafed plant. "This is Matoska, the healing root. This one is Ate, the dream leaf. Over there is Chaitin's bloom, which can stop a bleeding heart." She swept her arm across the valley. "This place is not a home. It is a library, the last one. Everything my people knew about healing, about living, is in this soil. This is my father's legacy." She finally met his eyes, and he saw a terrifying, heartbreaking clarity in them. "The railroad doesn't just want a path through the mountains, Silas. Thorne's surveyors found this place. He knows what's here. He doesn't want to build a railroad. He wants to own a cure. This is what he sent his men to steal, what my father died protecting." The weight that had lifted from Silas's soul crashed back down, heavier than any mountain. He had walked into a war he didn't understand, honoring a debt that was a pale shadow of the true stakes. This wasn't about one woman. It was about a legacy that could change the world, a priceless treasure that a man like Thorn would burn the entire territory to the ground to possess. His vow to the dead chief was finished. But looking at the quiet determination in Anaya's face, at the sacred trust of this living library around them, Silas Kane made a new choice. He had a new contract to honor, one written not in the past but in the present, a vow to the living. His mission was just beginning. Their fragile peace was shattered a week later. Thorn, as Anaya had predicted, did not give up. He brought in men with ropes and drills, bypassing the sealed pass, and descended on the valley like locusts. It was not a battle. It was an extermination. They came with torches, their goal not capture, but annihilation, to destroy the legacy forever. Anaya fought like a cornered grizzly, her strength a thing of terrifying beauty, but there were too many. Silas, moving like a phantom, used his tactical knowledge of the valley's choke points to harry them, to slow them down. He was leading a small group of riflemen away from a dense patch of the sacred plants when he saw it, a man with a torch about to set fire to the silver-leafed mataska. Without thinking, Silas broke cover, his pistols barking, dropping the man. But a second rifleman was waiting. The shot slammed into Silas's side, a hot, vicious punch that threw him to the ground. Anaya saw him fall. With a roar of pure fury, she broke through Thorn's line, a whirlwind of destructive power. She cleared a path to his side, hoisted his wounded body over her shoulder as if he weighed nothing, and carried him to the shelter of a shallow cave as the battle raged. The wound was bad, a deep, ragged tear that was bleeding profusely. He was dying. She laid him down, her hands, usually so strong, now trembling. She had the knowledge to save him, but the cost was unthinkable. The poultice required the root of Chaitin's bloom, the plant that could stop a bleeding heart, the very last one in the valley, the living seed of her people's future. For a moment she was paralyzed, trapped between the past and the future. Let the last of her line die, or let the man who had honored his vow perish? She looked at his face, pale and still, and the choice was gone. With a sob of grief, she prepared the root, sacrificing her people's legacy to save this one, small, honorable man. They won. They drove Thorn's men out, but the valley was a smoldering ruin. The library was ashes. The legacy was gone. Anaya sat beside a sleeping, feverish Silas, a profound, hollow despair settling over her. She had won the battle but lost the war. Her protector was alive, but her purpose was dead. With numb fingers, she reached for the carved bird, the last thing her father had touched. She ran a thumb over its smooth surface and felt a small, almost imperceptible click. It wasn't just a carving, it was a locket. Her breath caught in her throat. She worked her nail into the seam and twisted. It opened, and inside, nestled in a bed of soft wool, lay a dozen tiny black seeds. Hope was not lost. It had been in his pocket all along. Anaya's healing was a slow, quiet art. For days, she was a ghost in the cave, tending to Silas's fever, her hands gentle but certain as she ground herbs and cleaned his wound. She moved with a silent economy, wasting no motion, her grief for the valley a tightly banked fire behind her eyes. Silas, adrift in a haze of pain, watched her as a man might watch a river, a force too powerful to comprehend, yet the very source of his life. He saw the way she measured out the precious water, the way she carefully tended a small fire, the immense weary strength in her shoulders. He was alive because she had sacrificed her entire world to keep him so. Clarity, when it returned, was like a physical blow. On the 5th day, the fever broke. Silas sat up, the pain in his side a dull, hot ache, and looked at the ruin of the valley through the mouth of the cave. He saw the blackened earth, the charred skeletons of the plants, and in that moment of absolute stillness, he finally saw the truth of himself. His entire life had been a series of contracts, a ledger of debts and payments. He had worshipped the letter of the law, the cold math of an oath fulfilled. His honor was a fortress he had built around an empty heart. He had come to protect a woman to satisfy a contract to a dead man, an act of supreme selfish pride. But Anaya had saved him not out of obligation, but out of a fierce protective loyalty to the living. The contract was a ghost. This, the ash, her grief, his life, this was real. "He will be back," Anaya said, her voice flat as she looked out at the devastation. "He won't leave the root systems. He will bring heavy machinery to dig them up." Silas looked at the distant mountains, at the thin, ugly scar of the new railway being cut through the pass. He thought not as a gunslinger preparing for a final stand, but as a tactician seeing the chessboard for the first time. Heavy machinery. Thorn couldn't haul it over the mountains. He had to bring it in by rail. An entire lifetime spent as a bounty hunter, as a man who knew how to blow open a mine shaft or collapse a tunnel, suddenly coalesced into a single, brilliant point of clarity. His skills were not a tool for lonely vengeance. They were the perfect weapon to protect a legacy. "No," Silas said, his voice raw but steady. "He won't." A new plan, daring and terrible, began to form in his mind. He needs his railroad, and a railroad has a heart. We're not going to defend the valley. We're going to kill his dream. They moved under the cover of a moonless night, two ghosts leaving a graveyard behind. Their journey was a silent testament to their new partnership. Anaya's strength and knowledge of the land got them through the harsh wilderness, while Silas's cunning and tactical mind planned their route, avoiding patrols, moving through the shadows. There were no longer orders, only a shared, unspoken understanding. He was the fuse, and she was the fire. The target was a marvel of engineering and arrogance, the newly completed trestle bridge over Serpent Canyon, the final critical artery that would connect Thorn's railroad to the world. It was a skeletal giant of timber and steel, a monument to Thorn's ambition, and the only way he could bring in the heavy machinery he needed to gut the valley. It was his dream made manifest. It was his heart. And Silas Kane had come to break it. The plan was a chess game of deadly precision. For 2 days, Anaya became a phantom warrior in the hills surrounding the bridge, a ghost story made real. She drew Thorn's main guard force into a frustrating, fruitless chase, using her knowledge of the terrain to create false trails, to trigger small rock slides, to become an omnipresent, unseen threat that frayed their nerves and pulled them further and further away from their post. Her strength was not used for brute force, but for misdirection, a grand and masterful feint. Her diversion gave Silas the one thing he needed: time. He moved like a shadow beneath the bridge, his small size allowing him to slip into the lattice of beams and supports, a place no normal man could reach. He worked with a surgeon's focus, his hands steady, his mind a calm sea of calculations. He placed the charges not to create a chaotic explosion, but to scientifically sever the bridge's load-bearing joints. As he set the last charge, he saw them, a small crew of Chinese laborers sent out for a final structural check, trapped on the far side of the bridge. They were disposable men in Thorn's equation. They were not in Silas's. The final confrontation happened as the sun began to set, painting the canyon in blood and gold. Thorn arrived on a handcar, his face a mask of triumph, flanked by his last 2 guards. He saw only Silas, a small, wounded man standing alone in the center of his magnificent bridge. But then he saw Anaya, appearing as if from the stone itself at the far end of the canyon, blocking the path of his fleeing guards. He was trapped. "It's over, Thorn," Silas said, his hand on the detonator plunger. Thorn laughed, a raw, ugly sound. "You think I care about this bridge? I'll build a dozen more. I'm building the future." "Your future ends here," Silas countered, his voice quiet, "and you'll die alone." But then his gaze flickered to the terrified laborers. Anaya saw it too, a silent question passing between them. He could detonate it now, a clean, simple victory. But it wouldn't be an honorable one. With a final shared nod of understanding, Anaya let out a war cry that echoed off the canyon walls and charged. It was not a feint. It was a living avalanche. The guards turned, panicking, firing wildly. Her attack was a brutal, beautiful distraction that bought Silas the seconds he needed. He abandoned the detonator, sprinting across the bridge, screaming at the laborers in a language of gestures and raw urgency. "Get off. Now." Thorn, his eyes wide with disbelief, raised his pistol to fire at the fleeing workers, at the one final detail he refused to lose control of. But Silas was there. his smaller body a blur of motion, crashing into the barren, not with the force of a warrior, but with the simple, desperate weight of a man putting himself between a monster and an innocent. The two men, an unstoppable force and an immovable object of greed, went over the side, a tangled mess of limbs falling into the shadows. Anaya, having dispatched the guards, reached the detonator. She looked down into the canyon, at the place where the man who had honored his vow had just vanished. Then she looked at the fleeing, terrified laborers, now safely on the far side. With a final guttural cry of grief and justice, she slammed her hand down on the plunger. The explosion was not a chaotic blast, but a sharp surgical crack. The great bridge groaned, its steel heart broken, and with a slow, agonizing majesty, it tore itself apart, plunging into the darkness of the canyon below. Thorne's dream was dead. Months later, spring had come to the still place. The blackened earth was healing, and a patchwork of small, neat gardens was emerging from the ash. The tiny black seeds from the locket had taken root. But Silas and Anaya were not alone. A handful of families' orphaned children from Dusty Gulch, a displaced Chinese family from the railroad camp, a widow who had lost her farm to Thorne's ambition, had found their way to the hidden valley. It was no longer a library or a sanctuary. It was a town. Silas, his side scarred but healed, stood on a rise watching the children. He was not teaching them to fight. He was teaching them how to think, how to read the land, how to build something that would last. He had thought honor was a debt paid to the dead, a closed ledger. He knew now that true honor was an investment in the living, a debt paid forward with no expectation of return. Anaya stood beside him, a head and a half taller, her presence a solid, comforting mountain. She moved among the gardens, her hands, once weapons of war, now gentle and certain as they taught the women which leaves healed a fever, which roots soothed a cough. She had thought her strength made her a monster, a legend destined to be alone. She knew now that her strength made her a protector, the unbreachable wall around a new and fragile world. They did not look at each other. They stood side by side, their shoulders almost touching, and looked out at their legacy. It was a garden grown from ashes, a community built from broken pieces, a quiet, defiant promise whispered in the heart of a hostile world. It was a home, and it would endure.